Florida gets treated like one long joke about theme parks and weird news headlines. But underneath all that, there's a state packed with genuinely strange, genuinely real places most residents drive right past without ever knowing they exist. A castle built by one heartbroken man. A town full of psychics. A missile base hidden in a swamp. So here are 15 hidden places in Florida even locals can't believe exist. Number 15. Bulow Plantation Ruins, Flagler County. Bulow Plantation once sprawled across more than 4,600 acres along a tidal creek near what's now Flagler Beach, and by the early 1830s it had grown into the largest sugar plantation in East Florida, producing sugar, cotton, rice, and indigo. It was built and run entirely through the forced labor of over 200 enslaved people, and the plantation's coquina stone sugar mill was considered one of the most advanced in the region. Naturalist John James Audubon even stayed there as a guest over Christmas in 1831, later describing the hospitality in a letter to a patron. That prosperity ended abruptly with the Second Seminole War. In January 1836, American militia occupied the plantation and placed its young owner, John Bulow, under house arrest after he objected to the fortification of his own home. Within days of the troops finally retreating to St. Augustine, Seminole forces burned the entire compound to the ground. Bulow died a few months later, and the plantation was never rebuilt. What's left today sits quietly inside a 150-acre state park, scorched coquina walls, a handful of wells, and the crumbling foundation of a mansion that never got a second chance. Most Floridians drive right past the turnoff without knowing one of the state's most dramatic pieces of frontier history is sitting a few hundred yards off the highway. Number 14. Turtle Mound, New Smyrna Beach. Turtle Mound sits along the Indian River shoreline just south of New Smyrna Beach, and at roughly 50 feet tall, it's the largest shell midden anywhere on the U.S. mainland. It's not a natural hill. It's an enormous pile of discarded oyster shells, built up gradually by the Timucua people over hundreds of years, between roughly 800 and 1400 AD, and it originally stood even taller before shell mining in the 1800s and 1900s shaved off a good chunk of its height. The mound was so massive, it doubled as a navigational landmark. Spanish explorers documented sighting it from as far as 7 miles out at sea, using it the same way sailors would use a lighthouse, long before anyone had built an actual one anywhere nearby. Archaeologists believe the site may have also served as a refuge during hurricanes, giving the Timucua somewhere dry and elevated to wait out major storms in a landscape that's otherwise almost entirely flat. Today, a boardwalk leads visitors up and over the mound, through a dense maritime hammock that's grown up around it, with sweeping views of Mosquito Lagoon from the top. Most people driving down A1A have no idea the low green hill beside the road is actually a several hundred-year-old trash pile that outlasted the civilization that built it. Number 13. Boca Chica Key Lighthouse, Biscayne National Park. Boca Chica Key is a tiny, 32-acre island in Biscayne Bay, and its most recognizable feature, a 65-foot coral rock lighthouse, has never once guided a single ship to safety. It was built in 1937 by Mark Honeywell, the industrialist behind the company that still bears his name, after he bought the island as a private getaway for himself and his wealthy Miami friends. Honeywell had the lighthouse constructed mainly as decoration, a dramatic entrance marker for guests arriving by yacht, and according to local accounts, he'd even fire a small cannon whenever visitors pulled into the harbor. The U.S. Coast Guard quickly shut down any actual navigational use of the light, ruling that an unregistered beacon could confuse boaters rather than help them, so it spent nearly 90 years as the most elaborate, least functional lighthouse in the state. Honeywell sold the island in 1945 after a personal tragedy struck the family there, and it eventually became part of Biscayne National Park. The lighthouse, chapel, and stone buildings he built are now a protected historic district, only reachable by boat, and rangers occasionally open the tower so visitors can climb to the top for a panoramic view of a skyline the lighthouse was never actually built to serve. Number 12. Waukulla Springs, near Tallahassee. Waukulla Springs, just south of Tallahassee, holds the title of one of the largest and deepest freshwater springs on the planet, pushing out roughly 400,000 gallons of impossibly clear water every minute. The spring basin runs nearly 185 feet deep in places, and it's been pulling in curious visitors and Hollywood film crews for close to a century. 6 Tarzan movies were filmed there in the 1930s and 40s, with Johnny Weissmuller swinging through the very cypress trees still lining the riverbank today, and in 1954, the spring doubled as the swampy backdrop for Creature from the Black Lagoon. Long before any of that, the water's remarkable clarity had already been drawing scientific attention, with the fossilized bones of an Ice Age mastodon pulled from the spring basin as far back as 1850. The park's glass-bottom boat tours date back even further than the movies, to 1875, when local boatmen sealed a pane of glass into the floor of a rowboat and charged visitors a quarter to peer down into the depths. Today's tours run on quieter electric boats, gliding past alligators, turtles, and wintering manatees, on a spring so consistently impressive that a former Florida Chief Justice once claimed no gubernatorial candidate stood much chance of winning without announcing their campaign there first. The historic lodge overlooking the spring was built in 1937 by Ed Ball, a wealthy businessman who owned the property for over 50 years before the state finally purchased it in the 1980s and turned it into the Edward Ball Waukulla Springs State Park. In its heyday, the lodge hosted an unusually varied guest list, from the Shah of Iran and King Hussein of Jordan to a long string of Florida governors and, during World War II, U.S. Army troops using the property as a training and rest stop. Even now, the springs still pump out roughly 400,000 gallons of water a minute, cold enough to keep the swimming area a brisk 70 degrees year-round, no matter how hot the surrounding Florida summer gets. Number 11. Devil's Mill Hopper, Gainesville. Just outside Gainesville, tucked into an otherwise flat stretch of North Florida sand and pine, sits a sinkhole big enough to hold its own miniature rainforest. Devil's Mill Hopper plunges 120 feet deep and stretches 500 feet across, formed over thousands of years as acidic groundwater slowly dissolved the limestone underneath until the ground eventually gave way and collapsed inward. The name comes from its funnel shape, which reminded early settlers of a mill hopper, the chute that feeds grain down into a grinding wheel, combined with the fossilized bones occasionally found at the bottom, which fed local legends that the pit led straight down to the devil himself. In reality, those bones are ancient marine and land fossils, remnants of a Florida that used to sit underwater millions of years ago, and the exposed rock walls of the sinkhole reveal more than 100 feet of visible geological layers, making it one of the best natural cross-sections of Florida's history anywhere in the state. A 232-step staircase now leads visitors down into the sink, past small waterfalls trickling over the limestone walls, into a noticeably cooler, shadier microclimate that feels nothing like the sandy scrub surrounding it. It was actually owned by the University of Florida's Science Department for decades before becoming a state park in the 1970s, after student parties left the fragile site a little too littered for research purposes. Number 10. HM69 Nike Missile Site, Everglades National Park. Deep inside Everglades National Park, tucked among sawgrass and alligators, sits one of the best-preserved Cold War military installations left in the entire country. HM69 was built by the Army Corps of Engineers and completed in 1964, rushed into service in direct response to the Cuban Missile Crisis just 2 years earlier, when Soviet missiles were confirmed on Cuban soil roughly 90 miles away. The base housed Nike Hercules missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, positioned specifically to intercept incoming bombers before they could reach South Florida, with a flight time to Cuba estimated at around 90 seconds. 3 missile barns, an assembly building, barracks, and even a kennel for guard dogs still stand largely as they were left when the site was quietly deactivated in 1979, making it one of the most intact Nike installations anywhere in the continental United States. The National Park Service now preserves HM69 as a historic site, complete with a restored missile shell reinstalled inside one of the barns in 2012 by students from a local vocational school. It's open to the public through guided ranger tours during the winter season, meaning one of America's actual nuclear-armed Cold War outposts sits quietly inside a national park most visitors associate with airboats and alligators, not warheads pointed at Cuba. The Army built the site on former agricultural land inside the park, once known as the Hole in the Donut, for the farmland carved out of the surrounding wetlands, and the compound eventually grew to include 22 separate buildings, from a barracks and mess hall to a dedicated missile assembly area. Because the site sat inside protected federal parkland, rather than being sold off for scrap after deactivation, the National Park Service was able to simply lock the gates and leave nearly everything in place, right down to the guard dog kennel, for the next several decades. In 2004, it earned a spot on the National Register of Historic Places, recognized as one of the last intact Nike missile sites left standing anywhere in the continental United States. Number 9. Spook Hill, Lake Wales. Spook Hill isn't really a hill at all, at least not in the direction it looks. Located on North Wales Drive in the small city of Lake Wales, it's what's known as a gravity hill, a stretch of road where an optical illusion tricks drivers into thinking their car is rolling uphill in neutral, when in reality, it's simply rolling down a gentle slope that the surrounding landscape makes impossible to judge correctly by eye. Locals have been telling stories about the spot since at least the 1950s, with a sign at the site attributing the phenomenon to the spirit of a Seminole chief who once battled a giant alligator on the hill, their restless ghosts still locked in an eternal tug-of-war over which direction the cars should roll. A rival version of the legend blames a buried pirate captain instead, though nobody can quite agree on his name. A 1954 tourism pamphlet from a local tavern is largely credited with turning the whole thing into a formal roadside attraction for post-war road trippers. Skeptics have tested the illusion with cameras and levels, confirming it's simply geometry playing tricks on the eye rather than anything supernatural. But that hasn't stopped Spook Hill from earning a spot on the National Register of Historic Places in 2019. It remains the only documented gravity hill anywhere in Florida, a free 5-minute stop that still manages to genuinely confuse first-time visitors who put their car in neutral, expecting nothing to happen. Number 8. Solomon's Castle, Ona. Solomon's Castle sits on 40 acres of swampland in the tiny community of Ona, and from a distance, it looks like a fully functional medieval fortress, complete with turrets, a moat, and a metallic sheen that seems to shift colors in the Florida sun. It was built entirely by hand by a self-taught artist named Howard Solomon, who began construction in the 1970s and kept adding to it for decades afterward. The castle's gleaming exterior isn't stone or steel. It's thousands of discarded aluminum printing plates, salvaged for next to nothing from a local newspaper that was going out of business, originally advertised as scrap material good for building chicken coops. Solomon had other plans. Peel back one of the panels today, and you can still make out faint newspaper text printed decades ago, running underneath a 3-story castle nobody expected to actually get built. Inside, the castle functions as a sprawling gallery of Solomon's sculptures, all crafted from other people's discarded junk, including an elephant made of beer cans and portable bars built out of old cars, alongside more than 80 stained glass windows he made himself. Solomon lived on the property with his family until his death, and guided tours still walk visitors through both the art and the sheer stubbornness it took to build a genuine castle out of a newspaper's leftover scraps. Number 7. Ancient Spanish Monastery, North Miami Beach. Tucked behind an unassuming stretch of Dixie Highway in North Miami Beach sits the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere, and it wasn't built anywhere near Florida. The monastery of St. Bernard de Clairvaux was originally constructed in Sacramento, Spain, between 1133 and 1141, and Cistercian monks lived and worshipped inside it for nearly 700 years before a 19th-century revolution led to it being seized and converted into a granary. In 1925, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst bought the monastery's cloisters with plans to ship the entire structure to his California estate. He had it dismantled stone by stone, wrapped in protective hay, and packed into more than 11,000 numbered wooden crates. Before the crates could be reassembled, a hoof-and-mouth disease outbreak in Spain forced U.S. agricultural inspectors to quarantine every single box, burn the hay, and repack the stones without bothering to keep them in their original order. Then, Hearst's finances collapsed, and the crates sat forgotten in a Brooklyn warehouse for the next 26 years. After Hearst's death in 1952, two Miami businessmen bought the crates on a hunch and spent 19 months and roughly $1.5 million piecing the medieval monastery back together like the world's largest, least labeled jigsaw puzzle, a job Time magazine described at the time as exactly that. The reassembled cloisters now function as an active Episcopal church and quiet public garden. Sitting almost invisibly beside a tennis center, most locals drive past without a second glance. Reassembling the monastery took more than patience. 23 workers spent months simply reopening the 11,000 crates, sorting through roughly 7 tons of nails, and matching stones that had been packed in no particular order once the original numbering system was scrapped during the disease scare. In 1964, a wealthy banker and philanthropist named Colonel Robert Pentland Jr. bought the completed cloisters and donated them outright to the Episcopal Diocese of Southeast Florida, ensuring the building would remain a working church rather than staying purely a roadside curiosity. Today, services are still held there in both English and Spanish, inside a structure that was standing in northern Spain nearly 4 centuries before Columbus ever set sail for the Americas. Number 6. Coruscant State Historic Site, Estero. In 1894, a Chicago physician named Cyrus Teed led roughly 200 followers into the swampy wilderness of Estero, Florida, convinced they were about to build the capital of a 10-million-person utopia he called the New Jerusalem. Teed had renamed himself Koresh, believed himself to be a messiah, and taught his followers a genuinely unusual scientific claim: that the universe existed entirely inside a giant hollow sphere, and that humanity lived on the inner surface of that sphere, looking inward toward the sun rather than outward into open space. The Coruscant Unity built an impressively self-sufficient community anyway, complete with a working sawmill, print shop, bakery, and power plant, governed day to day by a council of 7 women known as the Planetary Court, a genuinely progressive structure for the era. Membership peaked at around 250 people between 1903 and 1908, and prominent visitors reportedly included Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, who wintered nearby and stopped in to see the settlement for themselves. When Teed died in 1908, his followers kept his body in a bathtub for several days, convinced he would rise again, until local health officials forced them to move it to a mausoleum instead. The Coruscants maintained a vigil there for over a decade, until a 1921 hurricane swept Teed's remains out to sea for good. The last 4 surviving members deeded the settlement's 300 remaining acres to the state of Florida in 1961, and the Coruscant buildings still stand today as one of the strangest, most fully preserved cult sites in the country. Teed's hollow earth beliefs weren't just abstract theology either. He and his followers conducted actual geodetic surveys along the nearby beach, using custom-built instruments to measure the curvature of the horizon, and claimed the results proved the Earth curved upward rather than away, confirming they were living on the inside of the sphere rather than the outside. Modern surveyors have since explained the same readings as a straightforward optical effect, but the Coruscants took their measurements seriously enough to publish them as scientific proof. The last surviving member, Hedwig Michel, a German refugee who fled the Nazis and joined the community in 1940, kept a small Coruscant revival going for 2 more decades, running a gas station and Western Union office on the property before finally handing the land over to the state. Number 5. Casadaga, Volusia County. Casadaga is a small, unincorporated community about 50 miles north of Orlando, tucked among oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, and it's home to one of the highest concentrations of practicing psychics and mediums anywhere in the country. It was founded in 1894 by George Colby, a traveling medium from New York who claimed his spirit guide, a Native American figure named Seneca, had directed him to establish a spiritualist community somewhere warm. The Southern Casadaga spiritualist camp that grew up around Colby's original homestead remains an active religious organization today, built around the belief that the dead can communicate directly with the living through trained mediums. The community made the National Register of Historic Places in 1991, reportedly one of the only times an entire American town has been listed for its association with an active belief system rather than a historical event. Casadaga draws a steady stream of curious visitors year-round, some looking for a genuine reading, others just for the novelty of a town where nearly every cottage seems to have a hand-painted sign advertising tarot, aura photography, or spirit communication. 50 miles from the closest theme park, it remains one of the more sincerely strange places in Central Florida, a working spiritualist community that's been quietly operating in the same spot for well over a century. Number 4. Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, Ochapee. Just off the Tamiami Trail, in the tiny Everglades outpost of Ochapee, sits a roadside gift shop and reptile park dedicated entirely to Florida's answer to Bigfoot. The Skunk Ape Research Headquarters was founded by a local naturalist convinced that a large, foul-smelling, ape-like creature has been roaming the Everglades for decades, and the site now functions as both a tongue-in-cheek tourist stop and, somewhat sincerely, an actual field base for tracking reported sightings. Sightings of the so-called skunk ape date back generations among locals living along the edges of the Everglades, with reports typically describing a large, hairy figure and an overpowering, rotten smell strong enough to give the creature its name. The headquarters keeps a running file of eyewitness reports, blurry photographs, and plaster casts of supposed footprints, alongside a collection of live alligators, snakes, and other native Florida wildlife that visitors can see up close. Whether or not anyone actually believes a swamp cryptid is out there, the Skunk Ape Research Headquarters has become a genuine roadside institution, drawing curious travelers heading toward the Everglades who stop expecting a joke and often leave having watched a real alligator show. It sits directly across the street from one of the smallest post offices in the country, making this stretch of the Tamiami Trail an unusually strange few hundred feet of Florida highway. Number 3. Ochapee Post Office, Everglades. Speaking of that post office, it's worth its own stop. The Ochapee Post Office is the smallest operating post office in the entire United States, a single-room wooden shed roughly the size of a garden tool shack, sitting right along the Tamiami Trail in the middle of Everglades wetlands. The building wasn't originally meant to be a post office at all. It started life as a small irrigation pipe shed for a nearby tomato farm, and it only became the town's mail hub in 1953. After the original post office burned down and postal workers needed somewhere, anywhere, to keep operating while a permanent replacement got built. That replacement never actually happened. The tiny shed just stuck around, and eventually the U.S. Postal Service made its unofficial status official. Today, the Ochapee Post Office still processes real mail for the handful of residents scattered across this remote stretch of the Everglades, and it's become enough of a novelty that visitors regularly stop just to mail a postcard from inside it, purely for the postmark. Structurally, it's barely bigger than a large closet, and yet it remains a fully functioning branch of the federal government, quietly doing its job in the middle of alligator country. Number 2. Devil's Den, Williston. Devil's Den looks, from ground level, like almost nothing. A small, unremarkable opening in the earth surrounded by North Florida farmland near the town of Williston. Climb down the narrow stairway built into that opening, though, and the ground gives way to an enormous underground cavern, a spring-fed pool sitting inside what geologists call a karst window, a section of ancient cave ceiling that collapsed long enough ago that nobody remembers exactly when. The water inside stays a constant 72 degrees year-round, and on cold winter mornings, the temperature difference sends visible plumes of steam curling up out of the cave's opening, which is almost certainly what convinced early settlers the place looked like some kind of entrance to the underworld in the first place. divers and paleontologists have pulled genuinely ancient material out of the cavern over the decades, including fossils from mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats dating back to the Pleistocene epoch, alongside evidence that Native Americans were visiting the same spring more than 7,000 years ago. Today, the site is privately owned and run as a scuba diving and snorkeling destination, and National Geographic has ranked it among the top 100 dive sites in the entire world, an unusually high honor for a hole in the ground in the middle of horse country. Most people driving past on the surrounding back roads have absolutely no idea a genuinely world-class dive site, and a small piece of Ice Age Florida is sitting just below their tires. Number 1. Coral Castle, Homestead. Coral Castle is, without much competition, the single strangest thing one man has ever built alone in the state of Florida. Between the early 1920s and his death in 1951, a Latvian immigrant named Edward Leeds-Kalnin, a man who reportedly stood about 5 feet tall and weighed roughly 100 pounds, quarried, carved, and assembled more than 1,100 tons of oolite limestone into an elaborate walled compound, working almost entirely by himself, mostly at night, using nothing but hand tools and homemade pulleys. The popular story is that Leeds-Kalnin built the whole thing after being left at the altar by his 16-year-old fiancée back in Latvia, determined to prove to her, and apparently to the entire world, exactly what he was capable of. Whatever the real motivation, the results still baffle engineers today. Some of the individual stone blocks weigh as much as 30 tons, several times heavier than the largest stones at Stonehenge, and one 9-ton gate is balanced so precisely that a small child can push it open with a single finger. Leeds-Kalnin worked in near-total secrecy, refusing to let anyone watch him move or place the largest stones, even when he relocated the entire structure 10 miles north to Homestead in the 1930s, using nothing but a hired truck and his own labor. That secrecy has fueled decades of theories involving magnetism, levitation, and lost ancient engineering knowledge, none of which have ever been proven, and none of which Leeds-Kalnin ever bothered explaining before he died. As one recent visitor put it, the real marvel probably is just patience and leverage rather than magic, but nearly a century later, nobody has actually managed to close the case. The castle includes a working sundial accurate to within a couple of minutes, a 9-ton revolving gate, a Polaris telescope aligned with the North Star, and a set of stone rocking chairs, all cut from the same porous limestone and all fitted together with a precision that still leaves visiting engineers shaking their heads. Neighbors at the time reported hearing strange scraping and clanking sounds coming from the property late at night, and occasionally caught glimpses of large stones seemingly floating past the fence line, though nobody ever actually caught Leeds-Kalnin in the act of moving one. He renamed the finished site Rock Gate Park, and it wasn't until well after his death that the name Coral Castle stuck, turning a heartbroken immigrant's decades-long project into one of the most photographed roadside oddities in South Florida. 15 places, hidden in swamps, sinkholes, and roadside sheds, and every single one of them is real, still standing, and still waiting for most Floridians to finally notice them. From a shed-sized post office to a castle one heartbroken man built entirely by hand, this state hides more genuine history in its back roads than most people ever bother pulling over to see. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these you had absolutely no idea existed. See you in the next video.